My name is Stephen Dudley, and I'm the co-director of Inside Crime. Over the years, I've done numerous reports about presidential candidates and presidents themselves doing nefarious things. These are some of the most difficult reports you can do because you really have to have things nailed down tight. Solid sourcing, numerous sources, corroboration. You know what they say. You aim at the king, you better not miss. One of those stories was about Álvaro Colom, the now deceased former president of Guatemala, and his 2007 bid to become president. The story was about how the Zetas, the vicious Mexico-based criminal group, had given his campaign an over $11 million contribution. Well, not that we needed it, but we recently got more corroboration of this story. It came from one of the Zetas leaders at the time, a guy named Jose María Guizar Valencia, alias Zeta 43, or Z43. Guizar Valencia recently told the U.S. court during a trial that he and his cohorts had given Colom not $11 million, but $24 million in campaign contributions. The news made us want to revisit that original story about the campaign. When we released it in 2018, we accompanied it with a short podcast on the political operator at the center of the scandal. He was known as El Bigote, or the Mustache. The Mustache had been the intermediary on the deal, and for that, he'd paid with his life. Here's that podcast, The Guatemala Fixer. Hector Silva was the host, and I was his guest.
Hey Steve, how are you?
Good, Hector. How you doing?
Good, greetings. So Steve, I've heard that you've been traveling lately a lot.
Yeah, the traveling, it never stops. You know how that goes. It never stops.
Yeah, I know. So I heard that you've been in Guatemala quite a bit, doing some research and investigation there, and that you have been digging really deep into the issue of illicit campaign financing down there.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit how this whole thing, this story and investigation started?
Yeah. It's classic, right, Hector? You know this. You know this from working in this for a long time. It starts with a conversation, having a conversation, having lunch with a source, and he lets slip that the Zetas criminal group, that vicious Mexican criminal group, had visited the Guatemalan presidential palace in the early part of 2008. He couldn't put a date on it, but he did say that this had happened. And obviously my ears perked up. I began to immediately start to put the pieces together, pieces being, other reporting that I'd done, what I knew about the Zetas at the time, what I knew or thought I knew about the Colom administration. And one of the things that popped into my head was a story I'd done in late 2010 about kind of a forced press release that the Zetas had issued via a small radio station in Coban, which is sort of north, almost the heart, basically the heart of Guatemala is this city called Coban. And the Zetas had gone to the radio station and handed over a press release for a DJ to read. And the guy I knew there had pulled off the side of the road and had tape recorded it, and he'd sent me the recording of what they read, because there was no other registry of this particular press release. And in the press release, they said that they had given $11.5 million to Álvaro Colom for his presidential campaign, which had been victorious the year before, 2007.
presidente de Guatemala, somos el grupo Los Zeta y solo queremos que sepa el país que el presidente Álvaro Colom recibió 11.500.000 de dólares antes de cerrar elecciones de este país y pagará por no cumplir con culpables.
And, at the time, of course, this is a criminal group making this accusation. So, of course, you're going to take it with a grain of salt. But the press release that the DJ read over the air in that small radio station in Coban had a lot of detail. And some of the details were tantalizing and they were intriguing in a way that made you think that maybe there's something there. And one of those details was about was the use of a name that they said was El Bigote meaning mustache, right? And they made the claim in the press release that basically Álvaro Colón's henchmen had killed El Bigote, right? So then the question became, well, who is El Bigote, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it sent me on this trail that led to this story.
Okay, hold on. So, but this is pretty big. You're telling me. So, we've heard a lot lately about two presidents of Guatemala being involved in illicit campaign financing, but we haven't heard a lot about Álvaro Colom. And you're telling me that now the Zetas are involved, and through this Bigote guy, through Obdulio Solórzano. Who's this guy? Where does El Bigote come from?
Well, after a little digging, found out and actually wrote this in the 2010 report that El Bigote was who you said he was. He was this guy named Obdulio Solórzano. Obdulio Solórzano is he was originally I guess a small businessman. He's from a state in the sort of southern Pacific coast of Guatemala called Escuintla, a state known for being a sort of hotbed of crime and criminal activity, corruption, contraband, drug trafficking, hitman networks, you name it. Traditionally very violent place and crime-ridden. He'd grown up in this atmosphere and he had a couple of businesses. He had made contacts through his businesses and through his sort of personal life that connected him to politicians and would-be politicians. And he was what you might call a fixer. He was a person who connected different people to do business. Many times they're people who come from the outside, sometimes people who live there, but people need connections, right? So if you're a businessman, you need a connection inside the government or somebody who's gonna, push a contract your direction. So he was kind of the person who connected those two different pieces in different ways. And he caught the attention of Colón's party, which at the time was a nascent party, a new party, just emerging, trying to establish itself. Colón himself had run for president under the banner of the former guerrilla group earlier, and then had created this, this new party with his wife Sandra Torres, and they were looking to position themselves, and certainly a guy like this could help them. He ran for Congress, won a congressional seat in 2003, and became a fairly prominent member of Congress, if not a very vocal one, and continued to sort of expand his networks and become more and more prominent within the party by doing what he did in Escuintla, by being a fixer, by connecting the pieces. And these pieces began to include, I would say, increasingly criminalized actors. I mean, in all of these places, there are people who work in these gray areas, right? There's people who are working, kind of for drug trafficking organizations, but there are a lot of people who work like in the middle, right? They do a lot of things that are legal and they do a lot of things that are illegal at the same time. So he operated in that world, in that gray area, and he was very, very good at it. And that kind of positioned him very well within the party. and he became incredibly important to the party over time. And by 2007, then he had he'd become one of several people who was in charge of financing the campaign, financing Colón's presidential campaign for 2007.
Leal y obediente a la Constitución Política de la República, cumplirla y velar por su cumplimiento. ¿Jura usted fortalecer el Estado de Derecho?
So it was the kind of fixer that could bring in the money and people support and at the end of the day, the votes that this guy and this party needed, right? Okay, but where in this story of this fixer and this new party, where does the Zetas come in? I mean, how does this, nefarious Mexican violent criminal drug trafficking organization gets into this political strategy? And at the end of the day, how come, and I go back to the beginning of your story, how come the Zetas end up being so angry at Colom that sent him this message through the radio?
Yeah. In 2007, when he joins the campaign and becomes a very high ranking official in the campaign, Solórzano is assigned to go after money in various states, northern states of Guatemala. One of them is Alta Verapaz. And the capital of Alta Verapaz is this city, Coban, where this whole story starts. And Coban was the de facto headquarters of the Zetas. The Zetas was an organization, a criminal organization that was trying to expand and become independent at that time. And part of that process was to enter into and gather full force and really become a drug trafficking, or much more a drug trafficking organization, by taking over Guatemala, taking over the state of Guatemala. And so these two things come together. Solórzano is running out the Verapaz, and the Zetas are coming in to put a footprint and even more, basically take over Guatemala at exactly the same time. So they need each other. They're both in need of something, and they can both give some sort of return on that investment. And that's what the Zetas thought they were getting. At least that's what they claim they thought they were getting. They thought that by passing money through El Bigote, Solórzano, to Colón's campaign, in this case, they say they passed $11.5 million. We don't know if that was all their money or just a collection, because really what Solórzano did during the campaign was collect money, via various sources. What you do is you collect money. You get to use infrastructure of people. So, hotels for events, they give you services. So maybe they give you drivers or private armed guards, or they give you, free cell service. So there's all different ways to support a campaign. And certainly Solórzano was securing all that, but part of that was cash money. And part of that cash money, we believe from talking to numerous people who also provided some of this money and who worked in lockstep with Solórzano, that this money came from illicit sources, including the Zetas. So this is how it all comes together. What happens is, over time, after Colón has won, Solórzano is slowly sidelined while the Zetas go and try and, meet and do, from our understanding, meet with somebody in the presidential palace. We don't have any reason to believe they met with Colón. We think it may have been a high up aide, but we don't know. We don't have confirmation on exactly who it was. But there was an investigation into this, into that meeting. But even though they get in, over time, both the Zetas and people like Solórzano are sidelined. They're pushed aside, and there's a lot of infighting in the UNE, And while Solórzano himself gets a prize of sorts, he gets a high-ranking position in a development organization that's part of the state, and he's able to continue to do his fixing and become very powerful. Over time, he gets increasingly sidelined and basically pushed out of the party, to the point where in 2010, year out of office, he's been pushed out by corruption scandals. He's increasingly isolated, and he even, from our understanding, starts to look for inroads with other parties. And that sort of being a traitor to that level, we think may have just set him up. Both his knowledge of what had happened and this sense of maybe being a traitor to other political parties really set him up for his fall. He was assassinated in 2010. And so this is the elements of the public communique that the Zetas put out in late 2010. Is they're saying that Colón betrayed them. They gave the money, they gave it through El Bigote, Solórzano, and in return, what do they get back? They're being at that point persecuted by Colón and the DEA and others who are going after them in their headquarters at the time in Coban. And Solórzano himself is dead.
So, did you talk to the man himself? Did you talk to Colom about this? What does the guy said in his defense? These are huge things that we're talking about.
Yes, I did talk to now former President Colón in an apartment where he lives now in Guatemala City. To be fair, I went to talk to him about something else. I was at the time doing another project, so I hadn't necessarily prepared him to answer this line of questioning, but I did ask him directly about Solórzano. I did ask him directly about the rumors that he had been financed, or his campaign had been financed by drug money.
Ningún momento tendría yo que fallar si jamás hemos tenido una relación con los Zetas, ni mucho menos en campaña. Mi gobierno ha demostrado.
With regards to the drug money question, he categorically denied it. He made a joke that had he $11.5 million, he would have won in the first round. He ended up winning in the second round of the election. And he also said that he was attacked, that there were other drug traffickers that had actually tried to assassinate him precisely because he had such a strong, anti-narco position. So he tried to he positioned himself, behind this idea that he was an anti-narco crusader. And again, to be fair, by the end of his administration, even if at the beginning it wasn't necessarily true, by the end, he certainly had created a reputation for himself for going after narcos. But at the beginning, it was definitely, a bit of a question mark there.
It's believed the gunmen belonging to Mexico's Zetas drug cartel were responsible for the weekend massacre, leaving bodies and body parts scattered across the pastures. A pregnant woman with a young boy survived.
And with regards to Solórzano, he spun quite a few strange tales, revolving around his knowledge of Solórzano's movements, his connections with Solórzano's movements, or the people that Solórzano was connected with, which would include drug traffickers. He made a claim at a certain point that he tried to fire Solórzano, and that the U.S. ambassador at the time, Stephen McFarland, had called him and told him not to fire Solórzano, that Solórzano was a target of investigation, so please don't fire him. I went to Stephen McFarland and asked him if that was the case, and he said by no means had he ever done that. So there were a series of very, strange stories that were coming out about this. And they were coming from him, who I had heard from many sources actually had a close relationship with Solórzano. And that is kind of where the story becomes tragic, because when Solórzano is killed, you get no sense whatsoever that he was of importance at all to the political party or to Colón at all. I mean, there's no message from the UNE. There's no announcement from Colón. He's just killed. And I even went to investigators at the Attorney General's office and asked if they even knew who he was, if they'd investigated the case, and no one even knew who he was. It was just like nothing had even happened. And here was this guy who was a congressman. He was very high up in the UNE party. He had played an incredibly vital role in electing President Colón, the president, and there was not a mention about him.
It's indeed quite a big story. And again, as I said, we've heard recently a lot about other presidents or former presidents. We've heard a lot about current president Jimmy Morales, heard a lot about former president Perez Molina, but had heard less about President Colom in this regard. And it's actually a very big story of this relationship with the Zetas through this fixture that ends up killed. At the end of the day, Steve, this story and this particular story on Colom de Une, Bigotes, Solórzano, and the Zetas, what's these things, these kind of stories, complicated, mixed stories of politics, crime, illegal money, what does this mean for Guatemalan democracy in general?
Well, at the time this was happening, Guatemala didn't even have an illicit campaign finance law, if you can believe it. So as far as we know, there were no laws broken here. If the money did go in, he very well may have had no knowledge of this whatsoever, or very easily could have avoided any contact, any part of the financing side of this. But the larger issue here is that there are no controls, or even when they set up these controls, which they have in more recent years, they've just been largely ignored by the major political parties. The other larger issue here is that these particular financiers are not going away. This is the way that politics is financed. It's financed, whether it's by a drug trafficker or a legitimate businessman, it's financed under the table.
Yeah, someone said that this kind of financing and the players around it, and what it means then for presidency, is kind of the original scene in Central American politics, not just in Guatemalan politics. Well, great, Steve. Great story, great conversation, man.
Thank you very much, Hector.